Hello everyone and welcome to episode 25 of the Layton Fitness podcast. Now in today's episode we're going to be discussing misinterpretations of if it fits your macros and flexible dieting. The reason why I think this is such a big topic to discuss is I feel, in my opinion, this concept has been completely misinterpreted. The perception within the fitness industry is the people that use this model just to eat quote-unquote junk. They're not concerned with food quality, they're not concerned with meeting micronutrient targets and meeting fibre targets. But the reality is actually contrary to that. The people that actually follow this properly, and in my opinion doesn't even need a name to be honest, but for the purpose of this podcast we'll call it what it is. Most individuals who follow this correctly consume 80 to 90% of their food from typical nutrient-dense whole foods anyway, and it's only a small percentage of just things they enjoy to fit within their macronutrient calorie numbers. So that just gives you a brief introduction of my personal feelings on the topic. I'm going to dive into a little bit more detail of why that's the case and why it isn't what it's being perceived to be, in the sense of people are just eating as much quote-unquote junk as possible to fit their daily targets. So the first point I wanted to make is specifically within the context of a dieting phase or a fat loss phase, where by default protein is obviously going to be very similar, but carbohydrates and fats are obviously going to be a lot lower than, say, your muscle gaining phase. And by default this makes it very difficult to fit a lot of quote-unquote junk within these daily figures. So this is just one prime example where people are misinterpreting this completely. So for example, as you all know, typically more processed foods as a general rule, they're typically higher calorie, typically higher carbohydrate, typically higher fat, and therefore by having these daily targets which are a little bit less than you're used to, say, in the muscle gaining phase, this almost forces you to consume the majority of your foods from whole foods, and only in a very small moderation can you have any type of process foods within here anyway. So this is just one example. Additionally, especially within a fat loss phase, because you're generally going to be slightly more hungry anyway, it would actually be a bad idea to just consume, let's just say for example, all of your carbohydrates from sugar, because one, it's not going to be very satiating, you're going to feel like rubbish, and it's going to be very difficult to adhere to. In addition to that, what I like to do with a lot of my clients as well is have a fibre target, and as long as you're sensible by meeting the fibre target, this is going to force you to eat lots more fruits and vegetables, again making it more difficult to eat lots of rubbish within the diet as well. So that was just one example. Within dieting macronutrients, within the dieting context, it's actually very difficult to eat lots of quote-unquote rubbish. So the next point I wanted to make, no food is good or bad in isolation, is the overconsumption of this food which can potentially cause negative effects. So the example I've given before, if you look back to my first ever podcast episode when I was talking about the clean eating myth, most people would consider, say, brown rice and chicken a quote-unquote clean food. However, if you overconsume this, or particularly carbohydrates, you could still gain body fat. So for example, if you consume this all throughout the day, yet you're in a 5,000 calorie surplus at the end of the day because you overconsumed these foods, mainly the carbohydrates, you're going to be in a caloric surplus, you're going to gain body fat regardless of whether that food is considered quote-unquote clean or not, regardless of whether it's whole food or not. And I won't go into detail on this today, but if you go back to podcast episode 1, you'll essentially hear my thoughts on that, whereas most people focus on the food in isolation, whereas they don't consider the dosage and the quantity of that food within an individual's diet, because there's a big misconception within the fitness industry where people focus on just the foods and they don't consider how important the quantity and the absolute macronutrient and calorie figures that that food may contain. So next point I wanted to make, there's a lot of irony with the if it fits your macros and the clean eating crowd. Essentially a lot of the quote-unquote clean eaters, a lot of them have what's called a cheat day, potentially once a week. And these quote-unquote clean eaters, they seem to put people down who follow, say, if it fits your macros, flexible dieting. Yet the irony is, because they have these big cheat days where they perceptions they can eat as much food as they want without gaining body fat, is obviously nonsense. But you're actually fine because they fit in so much junk in these quote-unquote cheat/binge days. If you compared a flexible dieter's weekly nutrition compared to a quote-unquote clean eater with the binge, the irony that I'd say is probably you'll see more junk food in total within the clean eaters with that massive junk binge day in comparison to the flexible diet if it fits your macros. You may have just small amounts of quote-unquote processed food within that week. And I want to give a little bit of a caveat as well. If you're following like I said before, I don't think you should even have a name for this, but if you do follow if it fits your macros, flexible dieting, essentially have a macronutrient and calorie guidelines, if you really don't want to include any indulgences whatsoever, you don't really have to. So it's not like you're forced to eat any of these typical indulgences anyway. So it's just an important caveat here. Now, the next point I want to bring on to as a touch briefly above is it's important that we focus on that hierarchy of importance, in the sense we focus on caloric intake first, then macronutrient figures below. But in addition to that, we also meet micronutrient targets as well. So for example, if you went too extreme with the types of food which tend not to be nutrient dense, you can have an issue where you have also micronutrient deficiencies. There's another reason why the majority of your food intake should really be typically single ingredient whole food sources. However, the clean eaters can also potentially have micronutrient deficiencies as well, because a lot of their thoughts and opinions, they usually box into a small set of foods and they eliminate a lot of other foods as well. And by focusing on a small set of foods, again, you can have micronutrient deficiencies as well. Next point I want to focus on is discussing how we should be really focusing on the bigger picture, macronutrients, caloric intake over the individual food sources. Like I keep hammering home, no food is good or bad in isolation. It's the overconsumption of food which can negatively cause potential effects. So an overconsumption of calories can cause issues, not a small amount of food in isolation. You cannot judge that food in isolation without considering the individual's goals, their caloric, macronutrient intake, their whole week's intake, their whole day's intake. All those different factors that need to be considered. And I also want to bring up the next point is Eric Helms, who I've discussed several times on my other podcasts. He brings us a really good point about it should be inclusive, not exclusive of your diet. So ultimately, you're trying to include all of these quote-unquote whole foods, but at the same time you can also include your indulgences, rather than being exclusive and being boxed into a small set of foods and essentially creating a very ill relationship with food, because you're saying this food's good, this food's bad, and you're eliminating large numbers of foods, which is just simply not necessary, unless, for example, you have a food intolerance or something like that. Another big point I want to discuss is satiation. Like I discussed when we're talking about the fat loss macronutrient targets, if you're just eating just sugar for your carbohydrates, you're not going to be satiated, you're going to feel like rubbish, adherence is going to be an issue, and thus this can potentially cause some micronutrient deficiencies as well. But at the same time, that's not to say you couldn't have some sugar as well within your diet. So the biggest issue with sugar is, again, sugar in isolation isn't actually a bad thing. It's the overconsumption of this, because sugar typically tends to be higher calorie. It's very easy to overconsume this, and the overconsumption of this will potentially cause a caloric surplus, and over an extended period of time you may have lots of issues. So this is the real issue, whereas unfortunately the media portray it as this quote-unquote bad, evil substance. Reality is it's the overconsumption that can potentially lead to a net caloric surplus, which over a long period of time can cause weight gain and all these other varying factors. But in isolation, within a calorie-controlled diet, within a fit individual's diet who trains frequently, in moderation is not going to be an issue whatsoever. The other point I want to talk about, as I briefly touched on the start, is almost comparing bulking macronutrients and obviously fat loss macronutrients. By default, if you're consuming more total calories within a bulking phase, you're going to have more calories to potentially indulge in, which is absolutely fine because you're consuming more total food, and as long as you're being sensible with your food sources for the most part, you're going to be meeting micronutrient targets very easily. The thing about micronutrients is it's not like more is better once you've met a specific target. So that's just an important consideration. Once you've met that micronutrient target, which will happen by default, as long as your foods, by the vast majority, are very sensible, you can obviously indulge in more foods you enjoy. Conversely, like I mentioned, if you're in the fat loss phase, The macronutrient targets don't allow you to do this. In addition to, it wouldn't be a wise move to have too much quote-unquote processed food within that specific context because of adherence, satiation, potential micronutrient deficiencies. Next point I want to make, in my opinion, having more of a flexible approach creates more of a healthier relationship with food because you're ultimately looking at all foods as neutral. No food is good or bad in isolation, but potential overconsumption of any food, whether that's quote-unquote clean, that's what's caused the real issue. So by having this inclusive mindset where you can ultimately include everything you want, but obviously certain foods more in moderation than others, creates a great relationship with food. And in my opinion, this can potentially allow you to go away on business, on holiday, and still be able to easily interchange foods to meet your daily macronutrient and calorie targets. Whereas if you're boxed into, say, a bland meal plan where you're told you can only eat these foods and the rest are off the list, what are you going to do if those foods aren't available? You don't understand how to interchange certain foods to meet that caloric and macronutrient target, fibre target as well. My final comment, please keep what I've said in here in context. This is so important. So the real purpose of the podcast was to help you understand that how If It Fits Your Macros flexible dieting is being portrayed as this quote-unquote fad diet where people are just fitting in lots of crap into their daily schedule. Conversely, it's actually the opposite to that. The majority of these individuals are having 80-90% of their food from nutrient-dense whole food, and it's only a small percentage of indulgences they allow within their diet, for the reasons I've given above. Hopefully you can see how effective this can be in the long term because you're not eliminating any big food groups. This can really help with adherence, can help have a healthier relationship with food, can help you feel less obsessive. This is a big thing I had personally in the past. Probably 4 or 5 years ago, I was a typical clean eater, had almost a good set of foods and quote-unquote bad set of foods, eliminating other foods for no reason. Whereas now, it feels completely different because you know how to interchange foods subject to what food you have available to you, and that's a quite empowering thing. So hopefully you've enjoyed the podcast, hopefully you've really taken a lot from this and you can really see the power of this. At the same time, please keep my comments in context and don't just think, oh, because I've set my macronutrient and calorie targets and just go out there and eat whatever I want, because for the reasons I've given above, it just doesn't work out like that way. If you've still yet to download my free ebook, if you go to James Layton, Layton Fitness.co.uk, it's called How to Set Up a Nutrition Plan. This will teach you how to set macronutrients, so protein, carbohydrates and fats, calorie targets for either fat loss or muscle gain. So I look forward to speaking to you next week. Thank you very much. Take care.